Hear me okay? Yes. Hi. Good morning. Thanks so much for turning up in great numbers this morning. Thanks to you in the room and to those of you online. Um, Feels like this pandemic truly is over if we can get so many people in one room. Um, and thanks for, I think this is one of the few times in my life when I'll say I'll feel sorry for the men in the suits. But thank you for yeah, feel free to take your jackets off. We know it's a little bit hot in here, and people are working on the air conditioning. So without further ado, let me kick off this first panel, a tough act to follow, Kristalina, but we'll try. Um, we are going to be going into the topic of the day, the month, the year, and unfortunately feels the decade. Um, and we're going to be tackling today the challenges of the current geopolitical moment following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February for the European Union, its role in the world, and its role within itself as a crisis management mechanism, and hopefully more. To discuss this topic, I want to introduce my panel in alphabetical order. To my left is Sławomir Debski. He's the director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs. The far right there is Arantxa González Laya, who's the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain and now the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. Online, we have Alexander Stubb joining us, hopefully from Florence, beautiful Florence. Alex is the former prime minister and lots of other positions in the Finnish cabinet. And currently, he serves as a director of the School of International Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. On the left, we have Sabine Weyand, Director General of Trade at the European Commission. And to my right, none other than the former director of this house, Bruegel Guntram Wolf, who's now serving as the director and chief executive officer of the German Council of International Relations. And by the way, my name is Martina Steves Gridneff, and I'm the Brussels bureau chief for the New York Times. Without wanting to take up too much of our time, just to lay out some of the elements of our conversation today before I turn over to our speakers. Some of the key issues that we're going to be trying to tackle today relate to Europe's assertiveness in an emerging era of multipolarity, in the context of the war in Ukraine, its ability to flex its foreign policy muscle or even find it, and how it can use instruments that it's better at, such as trade, in order to do so, and where that leaves a sort of rule-based organization at a time where clearly a more power-based world order is emerging, complicating its role in the world and its role within itself. If you're joining online, or even if you're in the room and tweeting or using other social media, I urge you to use the hashtag BAM for Bruegel Annual Meetings 22, BAM22. And please feel free to think up some questions for the final stage of our discussion this morning. Whether you're online or in the room, we'll be taking questions from both. Let me just start with some introductory sort of sharing of thoughts from our speakers here. And I think I'll start with you, Arantxa.
Thank you very much. I like that we are true to our objective to reduce energy consumption. So please don't lower the temperature too much, would be my recommendation. I think it's important to understand what is driving where we are today geopolitically in order to see whether the EU and how the EU is responding to this moment. And I would characterize this moment in three ways, or with three elements. Element number one. First, before we go to the elements, understanding that we are not in a new international order. We are in a new phase of the international order, one that is accelerating very fast and which is essentially composed of three important ingredients. There are many more. I've picked three. First, we have moved from what was a precarious balance to a moment of dangerous geopolitical and environmental imbalance. Essentially, for the EU, this means living at times of a structural insecurity, economic insecurity, social insecurity, environmental insecurity, nuclear playing a much greater role than it was playing up until now, and that should worry us, and energy insecurity. That is the name of the game today. There is two main theaters of this insecurity in the world. One is in the Atlantic, one is in the Pacific, and the EU is in the middle of one of these theaters. So this is, I would say, the first consideration. In this moment of a structural insecurity, how should the EU respond? The second element of this new phase of the international order has to do with the impact that this insecurity is having on developing economies. And the impact is sharper. We've just heard from Kristalina, financial tightening, which is accelerating and getting many countries close to a debt crisis. The triple curse of high prices on fuel, fertilizers, and food. And let's not forget an education gap that many countries on the development world suffered during COVID that is going to accelerate. And if we heard from Kristalina, one thing is that in order to fix the imbalances on the fiscal side, we are going to see a slower investment on their side. Why am I bringing those countries into the game? Is because what we are seeing is a greater bifurcation in the world. It's the end of a period of convergence and greater divisions. And this matters to the EU because many of these countries are important markets for the EU, but because also this will be an accelerator of insecurity to the European Union. Let's not forget what our neighborhood is composed of. Number three, in this scene, I would say it's worrying to see a breakdown in multilateral cooperation. And again, with a US that is no longer willing to play the benevolent hegemon that it was, with Russia that has very clearly decided to break the system, and with China that has a very selective multilateral engagement. So essentially what we're seeing is a structural insecurity, bifurcation in the development world, and a breakdown in the mechanisms that can help us cooperate. This to me, and I'll end here, points in the direction for the EU that is triple. One is greater resilience, and the name of the game is resilience. This is what open strategic autonomy is about. And this resilience will be tested in the next 6 to 8 months. And it has to have a very clear component of an energy union for the European Union. And without that, it's going to be very difficult to build the European resilience to this structural insecurity phase. And it means taking a bit more seriously security and defense, not only spending, but how this spending is done and where it is done. Second, obviously, if we are to respond to the bifurcation, the EU will have to avoid falling in the trap of the West against the rest. It's very tempting. We are seeing a lot of this. It should not be the EU's game. The EU's game should be to make sure it keeps a partnership with the countries that are, again, not just markets, but are drivers of security if it manages its relationship well. Finally, I know it's a bit sometimes perceived as a bit naive, but I think the EU has to continue to be an engine of multilateral cooperation. I'm glad to be sharing this panel with Sabine because I know how much she and Commissioner Dombrovskis are doing in the area of international trade with results, which shows that it's not just naive, but it's where you want to make your investment. So back to you.
Thanks very much, Arantxa, for this. I will now turn to the ginormous Alex Stubb behind me for his comments. Alex? I can't believe we're saying this 2.5 years into the pandemic, but you're muted. Still muted, my dear Alex. Thank you.
I think it was the organizers that muted me. They thought I'm finished, so I'm not supposed to speak, right? Anyway, really nice to see you. I'll give you some comfort. Here in Florence right now, it's already 30 degrees. And as of the 1st of September, our EU iCentral decided to cut off all air conditioning in order to save energy. So that's why I'm not wearing a suit. Nice to see all of you. You forgot to mention that Arantxa is also a part-time professor at the School of Transnational Governance here in Florence. So let me give you my 2 cents in the allotted 6 minutes, and I'll do it like Arantxa by giving you 3 points. And if you want the headline for this, I actually have a rather optimistic view about the geostrategic position of the European Union. And here are the 3 reasons why. The first one is that inherently the European Union is a crisis management organization. It moves from one collective crisis to another. I do fully admit that usually it has 3 stages. Stage number 1 is crisis, stage number 2 is chaos, and stage number 3 is suboptimal solution. But that doesn't take away from the fact that usually we do muddle along quite well. Now, if you just look at the latest crisis that we've had, I think for all intents and purposes, the European Union has not only solved them, but actually solved them with efficiency, stealth, determination, and in the process, strengthening the multilateral nature of the organization. The Euro crisis, example number 1, the asylum crisis, example number 2, COVID, example number 3, war in Ukraine, example number 4, and the energy crisis, which is now looming, example number 5. Now, you could argue that it's been a little bit chaotic and that the solutions have been suboptimal, but at the same time, for all intents and purposes, the European Union has done quite well. So point number 1, the reason our geostrategic position is quite good is that we are a fairly good crisis management organization. Point number 2, the reason I think our geostrategic position is good is that we need to start looking at geopolitics from a new perspective. Geopolitics is not anymore only about the size of your military, tanks, missiles, ammunitions, etc., etc. Geopolitics is much, much broader than that. My thesis is that the line between peace and war has been blurred. In other words, it's very difficult to define when exactly we are in a state of war and what kind of instruments we use. I know it sounds a little bit crass to say that in the middle of Russian aggression and a war in Ukraine, but the bottom line is that the instruments that we use for warfare are different, perhaps, from what they used to be. So I think this plays to the advantage of the European Union, which I guess you could not really define as a military power unless you do that through the soon-to-be 23 out of 27 EU, NATO member states. Now, Martina, you used the term a power-based world order. And here is where I come to my third point. I actually think that the modern instruments of power play into the favor of the European Union. I'll just give you one list and then I'll specify a few. But I would argue that the modern instruments of power are military, economic, technological, climate, geography, institution, science, information, data, and at the end of the day, lifestyle. Now, if these are instruments of power, I think Europe does quite well. Let me give you 4 examples where the European Union doesn't always have exclusive competence, but has a lot of competence. An instrument of power in today's geostrategic world is sanctions. Which entity has been number 1 in imposing those sanctions and which has the biggest impact globally? Not only on Russia, but with threats towards China, it is the European Union, because we are still one of the biggest internal markets in the world. If we put sanctions, it hits hard. Example number 2, the euro or currency. Currency can be used as an instrument of power, and we have the second strongest currency in the world. Arguably, you could even push it a little bit further, but if currency can be used as an instrument of power, I think Europe is quite strong. Example number 3, energy. As we can see, Russia is using energy as an instrument of power, which has forced us to react. Have we been able to react? Yes, we have. Has it been a little bit messy? Perhaps, but we find solutions. And as we move along in energy consumptions and modes of energy, I actually think the European Union is going to be quite strong. The 4th and final point I want to make about an instrument of power is information, or perhaps even the way in which we use data. And I think the European Union can be quite strong on that. So my 3 points today, Martina, is to say that I'm very optimistic about the strategic position of the European Union for 3 reasons. 1, it's a crisis management organization that is able to solve problems collectively. 2, we are in the process of redefining geopolitics, and that plays into the hands of the European Union. And then 3, the modern instruments of power are actually the types of instruments where the European Union has either exclusive competence or competence in general. And I think it has proved to be quite resilient in the financial crisis, in the asylum crisis, in the COVID crisis, the war in Ukraine, and with the energy crisis. Over to you, and sorry for being so big on the street. Please have me.
Thanks, Alex, for the characteristically upbeat message. I'll turn immediately to Sabine for her perspective. You don't have a microphone?
Thank you very much. Now, the previous speakers have made it easy for me to start because I think there's a lot I agree with in what has been said. We are focusing here on the watershed moment that Russia's war of aggression has created. But I think it is important, as Arantxa said, to recall that this additional crisis has hit us against the backdrop of an already very tense geopolitical, geoeconomic situation. I'll just give you a few key words. US-China rivalry has been around for quite a while. It has contributed to a weakening of global governance at a moment when we need it more than ever. We've seen an increase in nationalism and protectionism around the world. And indeed, the rule of power is increasingly replacing the power of rules. This is a development which we should not resign ourselves to. Martina, you said in your introduction, the EU is a rules-based organization. Of course, we are most comfortable in a rules-based environment, but that is for a reason, and we need to remind ourselves of that, because the strong may be able to survive at great cost still in a purely power-based environment. The middle powers, the smaller countries, will not be able to do so. So we are insisting on reviving the multilateral order through our investment, notably in trade and the WTO, not just for our own sake, but also for the sake of all the other countries that care about this. And there are a lot of them, because otherwise we would not have had the positive result at the WTO ministerial conference that we had. The crisis has also, Russia's invasion has also hit us at a moment when we were in the middle of major economic transformations. And here I'm talking about the climate emergency, which has given additional urgency to the Green Deal, but also the digital transition. And now we also are facing changed and negatively changed macroeconomic conditions. So actually we have a perfect storm here. But I would agree with Alex, the EU is united by adversity. You could almost say that adversity is a prerequisite for EU unity, but maybe that is pushing it a little bit far. But I think that is something we can build on. What I would like to focus on now is what is the way out of this perfect storm? And here I will, due to my job, focus on the economic issues and more specifically on the trade dimension. I think what the EU needs is a geoeconomic strategy for resilience. And that is a strategy that pulls together both all our internal instruments and our external instruments. We need a sort of double integration in the EU of our internal tools and our external policy tools. And for me, this geoeconomic strategy for resilience needs to build on 3 pillars. Trade openness, you will not be surprised to hear from me, a strong single market, and assertiveness. Now, trade openness is something that we need still. I mean, the same reasons apply from an economic point of view. We need economic efficiency. 85% of global growth take place outside the EU. We need to be able to tap into these sources of growth. We need economies of scale, especially in the new sectors. If we look at batteries, if we look at all the investments that are needed in order to equip us for the green transition, we need economies of scale. We will not be able to make these investments commercially viable if they only were to serve the EU market. So all this talk about self-sufficiency is very dangerous. It is counterproductive, it is expensive, and it's actually shooting ourselves in the foot. Now, I think we have also learned that through the COVID crisis, that it's not just about economic efficiency, it's also about resilience. And I would say resiliency beats efficiency. Sorry for doing violence to the English language for the sake of the rhyme. But I think this is something we also need to keep in mind. We've learned in the COVID crisis that just in case is more important than just in time. And that means that you need to have diversified supply chains. And the OECD studies have shown convincingly that such supply chains are much more resilient than shorter, more local or regional ones. So I think that is what we need to keep in mind. But at the same time, we need to avoid that we get into dependencies. We are seeing now the result of the biggest dependency that we have let ourselves fall into, and that is the dependency on Russian gas and oil. We must not make the same mistake on other issues like critical raw materials. And that is why we have been looking inside the Commission with member states at where we have vulnerabilities, not because of trade links. Again, we do not have all the raw materials or critical raw materials that we need for our twin transition, but to be dependent on just one source of supply. And that is what we are looking at with respect to China. And there we will have to find alternatives. That is what we are doing with our network of trade agreements, with our raw materials partnerships, etc. So the key word for resilience is diversification. And that means that we have to invest in links with the rest of the world more than ever. I fully agree with Arantxa. The rest against the West is a very bad idea. We will not master the challenges we are in and which are ahead of us if we think about a gated community of Western liberal democracies and market economies. There are just not enough of us around to make that work economically. And we share the same planet. We need to work with countries that have different systems, different economic systems, like China. We have to find a model of coexistence in order to make this work. So diversification, where should we focus? I would say Latin America. We have ready to conclude agreements with Mexico, with Chile. With Mercosur, some work to do on the sustainability angle, but that is something which is geopolitically, geoeconomically very important. And at the moment, we are leaving this region to China. And I think that is the worst of all worlds. Second focus is the Indo-Pacific. We already have in place a lot of agreements with countries in the region. We've just concluded New Zealand. We are keen to conclude Australia. We are working hard on India and Indonesia, and there are others in the pipeline as well. But we are also looking at other forms of engagement, bilateral engagement than FTAs. Take the Trade and Technology Council with the US, which I think is a good example to foster cooperation in a situation where the US appetite for multilateral cooperation and actual trade agreements is close to zero. Now, the second pillar of this geoeconomic strategy is a strong and competitive single market, because we can only be as strong externally as we are internally. So we really need to make sure that we have a competitive, innovation-friendly, contestable single market, because that will equip us for global competition. And last point, assertiveness. This is something where we have developed a lot in the last 3 years, recognizing the shift to a power-based system. We've done so with a certain regret. We would have preferred not to have needed these instruments, but we do need them. So we have created tools for security with export controls, which has served us extremely well now in the current, in the response to Russia's invasion. FDI screening, we are close to concluding the anti-coercion instrument. We are also dealing with level playing field issues through autonomous instruments like the International Procurement Instrument, the Foreign Subsidies Instrument, but also our values can be protected through autonomous instruments. It's a second best to multilateral solutions, but in the absence, this is where we need to go. Whether I'm talking about the global human rights sanctions regime, whether I'm talking about environmental issues such as the deforestation law, or the forced labor proposal we will be putting forward next week. So I think assertiveness is what makes coexistence of different economic models possible and ensures the openness we need for this geoeconomic strategy for resilience. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sabine. I'll turn to Guntram next.
Well, thank you. So a lot has been said, but let me try to make 3 points as well. I think the first point is really about our relation to Russia. I think we need to be clear-minded that for the foreseeable time, the European order and European security order will not be constructed with Russia, but against Russia. And I think that is really a statement that not everybody has yet accepted. There's a lot of countries within the EU, outside of the EU, that still think somehow accommodation with Russia is the way to go, will be the way to go. And I think we should be clear that with the current Russian government, this is not going to happen, and that has major consequences. And I think the main major consequence for that is, of course, that our energy security will not be provided by Russia, but will have to be provided from other sources. And you know, if you do the math on the energy transition and look at the issue at stake, we all know that the energy scarcity that we are seeing at the moment is not only a real drag on our economic activity, but a real threat to also our political unity. And I think we need to be very clear-minded about that risk and really address it up front. And to me, sort of accelerating the green transition is really the critical element, where I see some talking around it, I see some initiatives, but I don't yet see the sense of urgency that I think at this moment is really required. I mean, we need to all massively and extremely rapidly invest into this into green power to reduce our dependence on Russia even further and more quickly. So I think this would be really my first point, and it's an important point: being united against Russia, remaining united, because as soon as we are divided, both internally as well externally, the economic and political cost will be really, really big. Now, the second point, and Sabine, I think there I'm quite close to what your points is really on this question of global diversification, and how do we deal with the current geopolitical tensions from a geopolitical point of view, and I think the strategy really cannot be autarky, and I see a lot of foreign policy folks, if I may say so, so crowd to which I belong now, I guess, that really think we need to reshore at all costs and do everything at home, and that's not going to work. We are too small; it's not going to work. We have to really diversify. We have to do some more production at home, and I do think issues such as fracking and mining on European soils are issues that we should openly discuss now. I mean, there is potential there, but we need to. We cannot be self-sufficient. We need to diversify. We need to find new engines of growth, including in Latin America and in the Indo-Pacific, and also Africa, of course. So I would really put a lot of emphasis on that message. Diversification is needed. Stock taking larger stocks are needed to make supply chains more resilient, but not autarky. I guess my third point is, and I think this is a bit the elephant in the room, and people have referred to that third point with different notions, is of course China. And I mean, I heard Sabine, you're saying, if I paraphrase you well, we have to sort of find a solution with China. And I tend to agree with that. I do think we need to find a way of operating with China. But I also do think that until we get there to that sort of stable equilibrium of a world in which the relations between the US, Europe, and China are well balanced, and economic and security interests are shared, the road to that point will be very bumpy and will be very, very difficult. As a consequence, we need to really be prepared for some major risks. And so I think the first message here is really our companies cannot rely on governments, on the EU to just fix this issue in case something bad happens. I think they need to themselves prepare and diversify. The industrial policy agenda, I think that the Commission and others have put forward, I think is also the right agenda. I mean, it is the agenda to make us less dependent on specific risks. So I think in that sense, we have to really be prepared for a very bumpy road until in the end we come to a world where the major powers actually get along. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gundrim. And now to Slavomir. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Matera. Time for rock and roll. So, I decided to stay in my jacket because I was promised when I joined Analytical World some 20 years ago, blood, sweat, and tears. So now some swearing, some of them is part of the game. There is also one more reason. When you're swearing, you can realize that you really have a skin in the game. So, of course, my talking points, I sent it to you over the weekend, all gone, because I'm the last speaker in the panel. So I would like to make 3-4 main messaging issues we can talk about later during the discussion. So my first point is that any crisis is a reality check. It helps to verify our assumptions, strategies, ideas, illusions. Some of our ideas and strategies can be turned by the crisis into illusion, or can help us to understand that we have already lived in illusion. So Russia's aggression on Ukraine is a crisis for Europe, is a crisis for international order, it is also a crisis for transatlantic relations. Since 1989, we have all tried to build in Europe a Europe which is one, whole, and free. We try to reach all those outside of transatlantic institutions, outside of European integration, and all the time we promised them that one day that could be part of the club, that we could be united, that we could deal with the challenges ahead of us, which go beyond Europe, beyond this continent, that we could deal with these challenges together. And Russia was promised that as well, under the assumption that we will cooperate in peaceful way within international law-based order. And Russian aggression on Ukraine is blunt rejection of this presumption. Now, war is changing Russia domestically. So the conclusion for us, the strategic consequences of the way how war changes Russia is that we would live with the fascist aggressive state door to door for some time to come. And these would have strategic consequences for Europe, for us. Alexander said that geostrategy is not about tanks, it's not about heavy equipment. Well, if you come from Warsaw, which is actually closer to Kiev than to Brussels in geographic distance, you realize that if you want to stop an army of rapists coming to level your cities, you need heavy artillery, you need air power, you need tanks to repel them, and you have a big deal of ammunition. That's reality. Do we have it in Europe? And the question is. No, not really. That's the problem. So we will have Russia, which is aggressive, which can wage another wars, which can attack Europe directly. I can come up to this point, but not now. And we need to prepare to this environment here in Brussels as well. A second conclusion of the crisis is, we have mentioned Russia, China, Europe, European Union institutions, even legal base order institutions. Nobody has yet mentioned the United States. So coming to this, the reality check we learn from, which we are learning from Ukraine and Russia's aggression on Ukraine is that we would not have been able to protect and help Ukraine without the United States. I doubt we would be able to fight with Russia had Russia attacked us without United States capabilities. So we may have all wonderful strategies, compasses, autonomies, all this kind we may have in our papers. We are great in writing strategies, absolutely fantastic. We spend hours and hours, spend millions of euro on conferences, but in the end of the day, these strategies appear to be a piece of paper. We don't have capabilities. Show me your capabilities and I will tell you what you can do with it and how these strategies can be shaped according to capabilities you have. So that's the kind of the wake-up call for all of us, because one day United States may not be able to be with us for domestic or other reasons. For instance, being engaged in Pacific on kinetic confrontation with China. And still, we would be living with aggressive, authoritarian, fascist state next to our doors. Would we be able to defend ourselves alone? I think we should. The question is, the issue is that we should. There is no other option. Of course, and my last point here is, because I'm running out of time, but absolutely last point. We entered into this crisis with completely different strategic culture and strategic approaches. For nations of Central Europe, the lesson we draw up from the World War II is no more deals with the authoritarian powers. The Baltic states surrendered to Soviet Union in 1940, and they will be raping by the Soviets for half a century. Poles tried to defend themselves against Germans and the Soviets, but then they were subject of strategic solution imposed upon them by the great powers, and they were raped for half a century. So this part of the world have very clear understanding what is achievable in negotiations with the authoritarian powers. You don't have a peace or a ceasefire with them. The only way you could survive is to defeat them. So I think there is a completely different message that the Germans draw up from the World War II, because the German message is no more war with Russia. So as you can see, there is a clash of strategic cultures between Central Europeans or NATO East flankers and our allies living in much more strategic comfortable locations like Brussels. So thank you very much.
You see, Slavomir, it was a perfect idea to have you speak last. Because of this intervention, you've woken us up. I'm going to offer just a couple of concluding, summarizing comments, and then I'll turn immediately to the room for questions and what I hope will be a lively debate. But just to pick up from what you just said, and you've highlighted something which is difficult to grapple with, and we're seeing it play out on this panel this morning. This town is so much more comfortable talking and dealing and policymaking on peacetime endeavors that relate to the economy, that relate to trade. These are the tools that have been most developed on the premise that, of course, the European Union is a peace project first and foremost, but also on the somewhat antiquated or seemingly now invalid idea, or partially invalid idea, that if we peacefully trade with each other, then war becomes obsolete. And this is something that I think the denizens of this town find difficult to grapple with, the sort of, McDonald's idea that countries that have McDonald's don't go to war with each other. Well, guess what? And so really, this is my second stint in Brussels. I was here during the Eurozone crisis, and I was born and raised in Europe myself. And so it's the first time that I see the language of foreign policy and even of defense, indeed, and realpolitik be so close and needing to merge with the language of economic power, of trade, and even of, fiscal realities that Guntram and I have been sort of debating about for more than 10 years now. It's a really interesting moment for how this town thinks. And so thank you again, Slavomir, for making the comments you made in this forum this morning in the context of the war. A second comment I wanted to make, and this is sort of wearing more my work for an American newspaper hat, relates to an early comment by Arantxa that the US has played the role of a so-called benevolent hegemon. Well, certainly people in Afghanistan and Iraq would disagree with that. It was the hegemon we had, and they're clearly partly busy doing other things. And so back to Slavomir's point, this is a moment that calls for Europe sort of growing up in some ways. We see this in the context of NATO, and we also see it in these calls from particularly Eastern European member states for the European Union to assume its role as an owner of European peace and a protector of European peace, rather than constantly looking across the Atlantic for it. And to do that, we go back to discussing the instruments Sabina mentioned and the relationship that the two of you mentioned. And a third point that relates to the West versus the rest attitude that Arantxa also mentioned earlier, that I think really matters, because this town is so much more comfortable talking about hard policy that relates to trade and legislation and directives and et cetera, and is actually speaks about values in a more abstract way, almost like it's a complete thing that we've assumed we've accomplished and it's not a living thing. You talked about doing business with authoritarians and how it always sort of sours and eventually you're always betrayed. Well, what about the authoritarians not outside our doors, but within our doors? It is clear that part of the relationship between the West and the rest is based on a fundamental hypocrisy, that we've achieved some level of superior value-based existence that the rest can only aspire to, and we are the only ones who can tell them how to do that. And from all our perspectives, we are all responsible for that status quo. To achieve a relationship between the West and the rest that is not based on that is more, what DG DEFCO would now like to call DG international partnerships, and what Sabina has to do when she sits down with counterparts in the developing world and so on. We have to look at ourselves really harshly and deal with the authoritarians within our doors, deal with the failures in states that were much more mature, much more complete, much more sophisticated in terms of democratic values, closer to those ideals, and are now backsliding. And those include all the countries represented in the European Union. These failures are there, and all our partners in so-called the rest of the world are watching. And the number one country that's watching is Russia. With those comments, I would really love to turn to the room for questions. If you can, please make them real questions rather than statements. If you want a particular member of the panel to respond to them, please say so. I am not going to take multiple questions at the time because I think that's a way to not get them answered. And so please make yours short and begin by identifying yourself. I'm going to start with the gentleman just here. We only have one mic in the room, so bear with me. I'm going to go to Maria de Mertzis next. And then to, well, Heather, you had yours last time, so you have to wait. Giuseppe, you work for Bruegel, so I'm going to give you the gentleman behind Giuseppe. Thank you.
Okay, so should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, so, well, hello, first of all, I'm Pau Alvarez. I'm an upcoming student from the MARA program, both from the College of Europe and the Fletcher School. So as a student, I was really interested in the NATO summit from Madrid. I'm from Barcelona. And I was thinking about how can we, like anyone from the panel is encouraged to answer to that question, because honestly, I think it's a broad topic. But how can we construct a strong European defense policy after the Russian invasion, but especially, in tackling this inconsistency between depending too much on the NATO and our Atlantic partner, but also, we want to have maybe an independent European defense policy. So how can we navigate into these two waters? Thank you.
Thanks. I think Guntram is itching to answer that one.
Yeah, I wanted to answer that one and also react to Slavomir because I think Slavomir, you really put the finger in the wound on the defense side and the military side. And I guess now that I moved from Brussels to Berlin, so that let me take off the Brussels hat and put on the Berlin hat. And just to first of all second you in saying that it's really a really huge issue that we cannot guarantee our own security. And let me just give you one figure that I found totally shocking, and here comes the number again, is that France, Germany, and Italy together have provided less than 50% of the military support that Poland has provided to Ukraine. So this is a number we really have to work on. I mean, we have not been able to provide or not been willing to provide the ammunition, the tanks, etc., that Poland has actually done. And Poland is number 2 or 3 after the US and the UK. So these are numbers from the Kiel Institute on the world economy. This is a huge issue, and we need to address this. And I do think that the sort of build up of military capacity in the core countries is absolutely key. Now, the question is, coming to your question, is that going to be sort of done country by country, or is it going to be done at the level of the European Union as a whole? And of course, my instinct would say let's try to have some real European defense strategy and a grand bargain, even a European Defense Union in exchange or as a counterpart to a European fiscal union. I mean, that would be sort of a dream end state. But again, I think for the immediate future, there's going to be a lot of coordination necessary with NATO. And I think we need to make very clear European defense, the stronger it gets, the better it is for NATO at the end of the day. It's not against NATO, but it's with NATO. And we need to find the right combination of those two.
If I may follow this response from Gontram. We have to be realistic thinking about division of labor between United States and Europe. Because United States ultimately provides strategic deterrence to Europe. And strategic deterrence rests on American nuclear power. We don't want to have any European substitution or substitutions for that, because that would mean proliferation of nuclear weapons. So I think we have to find, to strike a right balance between US engagement, and the United States is a European power de facto. And this crisis shows it very well. It's United States that are able to protect peace in Europe. But having said that, there is a huge room we can do investing in conventional capabilities to make this house much more safer than it is, and not rely so much on American power, because we rely on American ammunition, American missiles, HIMARS, intelligence, satellites, on everything. Come on, guys. We are rich enough to do it on ourselves. So,
Martina, can I come in?
Absolutely.
Thanks. I know that we're running out of time. I felt that Slavomir perhaps misrepresented my argument a little bit. I was not downplaying the military aspects of geostrategy. I was talking about the strength of the European Union. And Slavomir, with all due respect, I come from a country which is 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia. That's double the border of the European Union combined. I come from a country which has mandatory military service and reserves over 900,000. Compare that to reserves of Poland under 200,000. We have 64 F-18s and just purchased another 64 F-35s. We have one of the most sophisticated air-to-land and land-to-air missile defense systems. We can mobilize in wartime 280,000 men and women. So it's not a question of, downplaying military any which way. And trust me, we don't have these figures because we're protecting ourselves from Stockholm. The bottom line is that there are different types of instruments of power that can be used. Where I agree with you is that we need to improve this capacity and capability in Europe as well. Where I disagree with you is the sort of somehow paternalistic approach that you tell the rest of the world or the EU what it should be doing. Sorry for being so direct.
Okay, so my reply, of course, I used your point for rhetoric reasons. You know, we are sitting in the panel, so we play this kind of the game. Yes, the only comment to your intervention is that you have invested so much into your defense because you were outside of NATO. Now you are bringing all these capabilities to the transatlantic alliance, and that's one of the most beneficial to Europe, if I may say, consequences of Russian aggression on Ukraine. So we are very welcome. And about being paternalistic,
I think there's nothing like a kinetic confrontation to get testosterone flowing. So let's move on. Maria, then the gentleman behind Giuseppe, then Giuseppe. Can I see more hands?
Thank you, Martina. Maria de Mergis from Bruegel. If I may borrow Alex's term of instruments of power, I wanted to ask the panelists whether they thought that maybe enlargement may be another instrument that could be added in the arsenal, possibly accelerated enlargement for countries like the Ukraine. And possibly an answer not from Guntram, because I know what he thinks.
We're going to go to Arantxa for this one, I think.
Absolutely right. And when we talk about bifurcation, I would start the fight back on bifurcation in our neighborhood. And this means making true the promise we make when we do candidates, our neighbors are candidates to the EU. And we've got low-hanging fruit, and we've got some that are closer to the gate and some that still have a little bit more work to be done. Second, I would say, in addition to much more work on accession, we need to take seriously the idea that Macron launched on the European political community. It's not that we should dismiss it because he launched it. Yes, he is known for launching lots of ideas. I do think there is a lot of merit in a political image of the European continent, not the European Union, Europe, including Switzerland, including Norway, including Turkey, and maybe, with a bit of luck, including the UK if it decides to look forward instead of clinging to the back and clinging to history. But there is a need to redefine security in Europe. And maybe this is a good way to start designing also this new security order for Europe.
Just a comment on that, the UK has been a very principled provider of defense equipment to the Ukraine, so we can all look at it and say, oh, well, aren't we glad they're gone? But, you know, they are doing some things right. The gentleman behind Giuseppe who had a question, then we'll go to Giuseppe. Heather, do you still have a question? Then we'll go to Heather.
Thank you, Can Ercan, Energy Counselor. I am Turkish. I work at the Turkish delegation to the EU, based in Brussels. The picture is very, unfortunately, gloomy, but after the brilliant opening session, very informative and excellent panel, Ms. Arantxa González-Laya underlined the motto, West against the rest does not work out anymore, and new partnerships should be made. I believe we have a very similar picture as in post-World War II. And until now, in Europe, complex interdependence ruled out. So, Ms. Laya, do you believe new cooperations will be really established without any interdependence or any new dependencies ruled out by the European Commission? Is it possible? And a very, very quick, brief question to Ms. Sabine Weyand. Strong competitive internal market. Do you believe it is possible to have a strong competitive internal market without competitive energy market in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we go to Sabina first?
Thank you very much. I think I can give a very short reply. The single market for me includes also an energy single market, or call it an energy union. Energy union also because it allows countries outside the EU to dock onto that, because that is what we need as well. And I think this is an absolute prerequisite. And this week, so watch this space, things will be happening on the energy markets this week, hopefully leading to decisions by the end of the week. So we still have a long way to go, but this is absolutely essential. And as I have the floor, just to pick up what Arantxa said, I really think that we need to look at a wider Europe approach in the sense that we have the EU member states, we have aspiring EU member states, we have to honor the commitments we made, but we also have to find new ways of accommodation with those who do not want to join the EU. The UK has already been mentioned, but it is a strategic partner which is important to tackle the global challenges. But I'm also thinking about Switzerland, and there may be others. So I really think that we have to have a more integrated view of what constitutes Europe beyond the borders of the EU.
If none of my other panelists want to contribute, I reckon we can get another 4 questions in if we're a bit ambitious and snappy. So let's go to Giuseppe, then Heather, then the gentleman in the blue tie, then the gentleman there, then the gentleman there. This is my target. So let's see if we succeed.
Very ambitious. Thank you. Another question for Sabine, actually. You've been mentioning in your speech, whatever you want to call it, your intervention, about this duality of the strategy of the EU between diversifying and opening up, which goes with the free trade agreements, but also things like the gateway, connectivity, and all these kind of things. And then the other side, the internal market challenge. When you say that, to me, it resonates a lot with what China is trying to do with what they are calling the dual circulation strategy. Now, question is not to go into the details about the differences. We are not going to make a comparative strategic moment here, but somehow doesn't looks like we are doing more of trying to do more of the same with different names and with different things in this competition that we might even think about just because the names we are using are different.
Well, I certainly don't think that the EU is at any risk of turning into China, because I think the precondition of the economic model that China is pursuing is the political system that it has. And I think we are fortunately quite far away from that. What I was talking about is that we have a strong, competitive and contestable market. That's why I insisted on contestable. That is not the case of the Chinese market, and we don't have the time to go into all the reasons for that. But that is what we need, because only if we have a competition inside the internal market will we be fit to compete globally. And that is the challenge we have. So we need to, and that's why we need to be innovation friendly, invest in research and development, have a strong competition policy to police competition in the internal market. Yes, also an industrial policy where we create framework in conditions for investment. But I hope that the difference with the Chinese model has become big enough. But it is very clear, trade actually should be called external economic policy. Not a very sexy name, but actually what trade is, it's the external projection of the internal market in all its dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. Let's go to Heather.
Thanks, Martina. Heather Graby from Open Society. So my question is about fitting the wings to the tank. The EU was designed as a slow-moving, gradualist economic organization, and we have, in the past couple of decades, tried to fit wings to it so it can fly also in security and defense. This has been, it's suboptimal, as Alex put it earlier, because it's really hard to retrofit to that kind of design. Now, with the war in Ukraine, we've just fitted a jet engine to that in terms of defense procurement and a number of other things. But it's still fundamentally an economic community that moves at the speed of its slowest member. So is there really much further that the EU can go in terms of crisis management on security and defence, or should we accept that we've already seen the limits of that? Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. I have Guntram and Arantxa.
Yeah, Heather, I think this question is excellent. I very much agree with your image. I do think we come to a moment actually where muddling through and pragmatism might not be enough. And there perhaps I disagree with Alex. And I hope he's going to launch an attack on me now so that we have more debate here. But you know, I do think this issue of the constitutional setup of the way we operate needs to be asked again, and that includes questions of how decisions are being taken. I mean, we cannot say we move ahead with more defense integration if at the same time we have unanimity voting on foreign policy and security issues. So these issues at some stage need to be addressed, and I think the grand bargain that, by the way, was a little bit seen in the recent speech by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, where he talks explicitly about fiscal and foreign policy in relation, and linking the two, and linking also decision making in the two.
Well, I would say that the EU is a peace project, and I hope the EU does not turn into a war project. But what we have learned is that the EU has to be better prepared for war, because now we have war, including in our borders. I would also say, bracket, close bracket, let's stop warmongering also, here or in other parts of the world. Close bracket. I think on security and defense, we have not had yet a comprehensive discussion on the risks. Borrell is trying to do this with the strategic compass, but when I hear my colleague here talk about authoritarian states, there are plenty of authoritarian states in the borders of the EU, and it's not only Russia. So seen from where I sit in Spain, I have a few other things to watch, and I have a few other authoritarian states to watch. So let's conclude this debate about what is our shared view of where the EU risks are. Third thing I would say is on security and defense, once bitten, twice shy. We had a serious discussion with the US on security and defense under Donald Trump. And we came a bit, let's say that we thought we had to do a little bit of work at home. So let's not forget that we also have to be autonomous from that point of view, which does not mean that we're going to cut the ties with the US anytime soon. It's our closest ally, but that we have to watch our back. Final thing I would say, there is two areas. One where we have a big low-hanging fruit that we are not using. It's called industry defense, EU defense industry. Defense industry, we do not need treaty changes to do defense industry. We have to be serious about pulling our efforts together on the defense side. And two, we've got a huge black spot called intelligence. You cannot have a serious security and defense policy if you do not have serious intelligence. These two don't need treaty changes. They need a better, a clearer signal from the member states that they are ready to pull their efforts. Now, if they've done it on euro, on money, I hope that we can do on industry.
Thank you, Arantxa. Slavomir wants to say something. Can we take a moment to say have a lovely day and thank you to Sabine, who needs to run. And I'm going to take, after that, the question from the gentleman in the blue tie. 5 may have been a bit too ambitious, but let's see what we can do.
Defense from my side. We can dream about Europe as we wish. We can talk about European peaceful development, everything. We have to remember, however, that our enemies do have a vote here. So we may not want to be engaged in war, but war may come to us, nevertheless. So that's my first point. The second, if you use the term authoritarian every minute, you may run out of your vocabulary. So if you name everything and everyone authoritarian, you may not be able to comprehend the complexity of the world we are dealing with. Thank you.
I'm sure we can all master the intelligence to deal with the word authoritarian. To the gentleman with the blue tie.
Thank you very much. My name is George Sapari, former ambassador of Hungary to the United States. I very much liked Alexander's sentence when you said the border between war and peace is blurred. Let me give you some food of thought for this. If you look at past wars, big wars, GDP matters, because the GDP gives you possibility of producing arms, sending people to war, etc. If you take this, the West GDP together far outstrips that of the Russia. But there are two things that nuances this thing right now. One is the threat of nuclear war. That influences people's mind, whether they think the same way about war, that if I have a big GDP and I have the force, I will stop the aggressor. So that's one thing. Second thing is China. Right now, China is sort of neutral. But what if China thinks, okay, this is a time to teach the West a lesson, and with its full power is beginning to back Russia war? I agree with what you said, that we have to arm, and I agree the war will come to us. I fully agree with that. But these are two things that I don't know how to factor in. Alexander, if you have any answers to that. Thank you.
Very, very brief answers. Thank you.
I really don't have a direct answer. My brief answer is to say that we need to find a mix between the two. In other words, a mix between idealism and realism, mix between soft power and hard power. And to come back to Guthrum, in an ideal world, I agree, we should take a leap forward, but probably in the world of realism, it's going to have to continue to muddle through. The problem is that all of us are trying to analyze a world which at the moment is extremely messy. And, the European Union is a little bit messy.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Alex, Arantxa, Guntram, Slavomir, and to Sabine, who's just left. Thanks to all of you. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but I hope you've had a lively start to the day. Stick around. There's more. Thanks so much.